what a dummy!
Welcome back to the Fantasy Rugby Draft podcast. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson, and joining me again in the booth is the man primarily made of moss, Nathan Mossman. Thanks for pulling in, mate.
It's a pleasure as always, Bruce. I think that Super Rugby squads are just starting pre-season training, but I feel like this podcast is already in mid-season form.
Indeed. It is exciting when you see a lot of the tweets going out about people running up hills and pushing tyres all around Newmarket. It's good times. Just a bit of admin. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Rug Draft. That's Fantasy Rug RUG Draft, or on Facebook. Or if you have any questions, drop us a mail on support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. In today's podcast, we're going to break down the New Zealand squads. They're in pre-season training at the moment, as I mentioned, and they were announced in October. There's a lot to get through, so we'll delve right into it, starting from the top. What do you think of the Blues, Mossman? Who jumps out?
I think one of the things that I notice when you look at the squad is just they've got a plethora of outside backs, and at the moment it's going to be really difficult to say who it is that you should be looking at. I think it won't really become clear until pre-season starts. So they've added Ben Lamb, who is a pretty exciting kind of prospect, but you look at the competition there for spots in the back three, and who knows who's going to get the run there.
No, and it's a real logjam in that back three when you consider when we did a recent a mock draft, and we had Frank Carlisle, we had George Moala possibly fitting in at 13, but Tavita Lee's also there, Ben Lamb, and you've got obviously Piatau and Visania who were the big performers last season. So we kind of settled on the thought process being Halai, sorry, not the famous Muslim rugby player. We'll go with Frank Halai and Piatau and Visania, but I'm not sure that that's what Kerwin will do, especially if we've got Lamb and Lee there. So,
I think a Halal Lamb combo is an interesting prospect, especially for a kebab.
A kebab and a dangerous Super Rugby combination. And that kind of dovetails nicely into who is the Blues 13. Now, it kind of depends a little bit on what John Kerwin thinks about his second five. So when you looked at the end of last season, if you looked at the semi-finalists, there were the Brumbies, the Crusaders, the Waratahs and the Sharks. And the one thing they all had in common is they had a fly half playing 12. So they had Dan Carter, Kurtley Beale, Stain and Lea Leofano. Now, I don't know if that's a trend that's going to continue, whether there's a copycat of all the other Super Rugby squads, that they want a ball-playing 12, the Aaron Major type of player, so you can split a ruck. You don't have your static 10 who goes always to the open side. They just play left and right. So there's something to watch out in, and an interesting recruit to kind of fill that position could well be Dan Bowden at 12. I know he had a lot of tackling under his belt up in the Northern Hemisphere, but I'm not too sure if a 10-12 combination of Ihar West and Dan Bowden is just too small. What are your thoughts there?
Well, you've got Simon Hickey to throw into the mix as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Who doesn't also come with a lot of physical stature. So, not sure about that.
No, it's a good point. Simon Hickey was playing last season. He got injured, and we never really got to see who John Kerwin preferred out of Hickey and West. He kind of signed West quite late in the season. So it'll be interesting to see if they do go with that smaller inside combination, or whether they will stick with Saili at 12 and go with Moala at 13. Because I think they will try and find a spot for Moala. It just depends on his psyche. What about John Kerwin's thoughts on resting? Are there any players in particular that are under threat for the Rugby World Cup and not wanting to burn out any of the Blues players?
Well, I don't imagine that initiative will come from the Super Rugby coaches themselves, but he might get the tap on the shoulder from Shag at some point about guys like Piatau. Although, given that Piatau did spend a chunk of the season out injured last year and didn't play a lot for the ABs, that it might be that they'll actually choose to give him the run out. Other than that, I'd say there's not that many guys in the Blues that I'd say, are nailed on starters to the point where, they'll probably be looking to rest these guys.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think the one player in the forwards you might look at is Jerome Kaino, but they've gone ahead and named him captain. So it's not like they're saying, okay, you're going to be a bit player this season, you're going to ride, everything's on the shoulders. They had an incumbent there with Luke Braid and have taken the captaincy off him. So I think they want Kaino to play a significant amount of Super Rugby time, so I'm not sure he will actually get rested.
Sure.
Okay, well, what about jumping down the state highway one a little bit for the Chiefs, your favoured Chiefs? What are your thoughts on them this season?
Oh, I think the Chiefs will go well.
Good answer. Great answer.
I don't say that every year, but so from a fantasy rugby point of view, we tend to focus on the backs, especially the outside backs, and Tukataramia is left and Gear's arrived, which isn't really good replacement and also much easier to pronounce. So that's cool. I mean, I find that Gear tends to add excitement. Bruce, what's your experiences of Gear?
Jose Gear, again, he's going to have a lot of miles under his belt coming back from the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not too sure what that back three is going to look like. So I don't know if they'll shift Marshall back to 15. They've got Damien McKenzie, who just won the Young Player of the Year. He's an exciting prospect, and we'll set aside where he went to school for a second. I think if you put Jose Gear and if you put Tom Marshall in there, and there's someone I'm missing on the outside back. Who's that third winger?
Tim Nono Williams is in there as well.
That's a good point.
James Lowe.
James Lowe, sorry, that's exactly who I was thinking of. Thanks very much. I think James Lowe will be superb this season. One of the interesting stats I pulled out the other day was that he was the top metres per run in the Super Rugby last season. So it was him and the left, I'm not even going to try and pronounce, Tamanivalu, the left winger for the Waratahs that came on at the end of last season, the fella
sounds good to me.
Looks like Will Skelton, only fast. And Ndolo, so those top three. And I think James Lowe will be a very, very sneaky draft pick come 2015. He's going to play a lot, and they also like to put him in that position of clearing the lines in the second five type thing. They pass it out to one side, and he's got a big left raking kick as well. So not that actually translates into much into fantasy, but I think it kind of dictates a lot of heavy usage for him.
Yeah, I've thought a bit of him playing for Tasman, and he just seems to be one of those guys that just makes things happen. He does.
He's very quick. I think Gear will be starting as well. I'd just be really interested to see. So I think in my head I had Tamanivalu and Sonny Bill Williams as the starting 12 and 13, and I think Dave Rennie will probably go that way as well. And I think there is a lot of fantasy rugby points in that midfield. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think the midfield's outstanding, and I think some of the points that they'll get will actually translate inside through to Cruden, and it's probably going to be a drum that I'll bang all season, but I'm pretty high on Cruden this season. I think given that last season we started off the season injured and he wasn't taking the kicks, so he lost a lot of those fantasy points to Gareth Anscombe. That won't be the case this year. I think the fact that he's coming into a World Cup year, I think he'll be primed. He's got Sonny Bill outside him. I think the Chiefs will be better than they were last year. I think that for me, Cruden's going to have a huge season. Yep, 2 points on that. So first point, do you think there is any chance he's going to be rested or been asked to be rested by Shag? Pick up the phone to Dave Rennie to say, look, I think a timeout. I think he'll definitely be rested at some point. Mm-hmm. I don't think it'll be significant enough that for me it would knock him down those ranks. He's going to be right up there for me. Yeah, and you're right. It probably doesn't knock him down a hell of a lot because a lot of the other players in the same position are going to be in the same boat with the resting. It might just knock a couple of players up a few ranking spots. Someone like a Damien McKenzie who may actually slot into 10. I'm not sure who they will have in that kind of reserve 10. Maybe Marshall goes in there as well. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe it knocks them up a wee bit. Yeah, there's probably not too many of the top fantasy players that actually aren't impacted in some way through international rugby. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I want to stress
to keep your eye on Tamanivalu when you're drafting. I think the shrewd drafters out there will draft him quite high. We have him number 4 ranked midfield, or 3 ranked midfielder at the moment, behind Mike Harris, Fikatoa, and Semu Karevi for the Reds. But I think we'll probably bump him up to maybe number 3. So I can't stress enough how impressive he was for the ITM for the Naki. He pretty much broke every line every time he got the ball. He's an absolute monster, and his assists were just off the charts. A much less talked about position is probably halfback for Fantasy Rugby Draft owners, but someone piped up at our mock draft recently and said that the reason TKB is in the team is because he's one of the best tacklers and one of the players that does a lot of work. Do you think Dave Rennie will stick with him, or do you think he's going to go with the Pulu?
I think he might ride the hot hand to a certain extent. I think you'll see a lot of both of them, a lot of split time, and then from a fantasy perspective, that will probably decrease the value of both guys. I think, whoever gets to start, chances are they're only going to be playing 60 minutes, and I think they could rotate them week to week. Yeah,
that's true. That's a really good point. That they do max get 60, don't they? And it is horses for courses sometimes with him, and it's going to be very, very much. I don't think you'd want to carry that second halfback on the bench. I don't think if you drafted Cavallo that you'd need to have Pulu on the bench. I think you could just potentially either pick him up, or if he's not available or he's someone's roster, you could find an equitable halfback that's going to play during the week that's had a good matchup, or even looks like he's going to be starting.
Sure, if Peyton Manning happens to get a run out for the Chiefs, that'd be fantastic.
Indeed. Omaha. Okay, that's probably enough to talk about for the Chiefs. I think an overarching comment would be that there are fantasy points to be had in the Chiefs rugby team. There always has been. They like to throw the ball a little bit, and they have some very exciting backline this year, and they'll get the ball to them. Dropping down one more, so Chris Boyd, he's come in. Who are the Hurricanes? Who stands out to you as an off-season purchase, or someone who might be looking for a storming 2015 season even?
Yeah, the Canes, it's difficult to say. I mean, Barrett was a standout last year. There's every reason to suggest he'll probably be as good. It's difficult to know whether last season was a bit of an outlier or not. I guess we'll see. Other than that, I owned Artie Severe at one point last year. Had quite high hopes for him. That didn't pan out, but I think there's been some improvement there. And obviously, he was, he's a really young guy. I think he was only 20 at the time. So,
what do you think happened there?
Oh, I think it might have just been a case of too much too soon. Maybe there was a lot of hype for a guy who was essentially coming out of schoolboy rugby.
Yeah.
So,
it seemed a strange one to me because he had just been on the All Black tour to the Northern Hemisphere, and it looked like, as he said, he was just going to slot into 7. He looked really exciting, and he looks like he's actually got a fairly good work rate and a good ethic. But I'm not sure what Hammett saw. There's something happened there. There was, as you said, maybe there's getting a little bit too big or a little bit too soon. I don't know. But Hammett's a shrewd operator. I think he actually is a half-decent coach in there somewhere. But I'm not sure what that came out of. I was surprised last season. We had him ranked quite high, Artie Xavier, mainly because he's quick. When you grab him the ball as well and he makes a half break, he's going to be tough to get. And those meters gains are so valuable in Fantasy Rugby Draft.
Yeah, I think the other point he emphasises, don't get too excited about any of these, loose forwards really, because it is a bit of a lottery. So, you might see a guy like Sevilla and think he's going to have a huge season, but I'd still keep the powder dry to a certain extent in the draft. Don't go too soon on these kind of guys.
What about Nonu? So he's come down back home again, some would say. Is he going to come straight in for Tim Bateman at 12?
I would think so. Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt about that. Whether he'll have a big fantasy impact, I think that's debatable. I'm not sure he really has in the past, and there's nothing to suggest that he will this year either.
Oh, he certainly had an impact. Just not really a positive one. He spent a lot of time sitting under the post, the same as Dom Pert. He got binned for a lot of non-shoulder tackles last year. I think he'll slot into 12. I think he'll go with Conrad at 13 as well. But to them two, for me, have a really significant risk of rest, especially Conrad. And I'm not 100% sure who's going to slot in behind them. I don't know if you've had a look at any of those.
No, but in terms of players being rested, I think it's worth keeping an eye on what might happen with Bowden Barrett. And with Jason Woodward joining the team, and we know how good a goal kicker he is from the amount of fantasy points he scored off the boot last year. So if Barrett, happens to take some weeks off and Woodward slots in, he could be fantastic in those weeks. So, he might be, a late round flyer in the draft that you can stash away and wait for that rainy day when Barrett's not there.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great key. Is this season your fantasy rugby draft squad is going to have depth, and if you can find a backup goal kicker or even someone that occasionally kicks in that depth position or that second or third outside back, I think some game week you are going to find that he will be the starting goal kicker, and Jason Woodward is the showcase for that exact situation. Yeah, so that's probably. Well, actually, no. So the Hurricanes' front row, they were the highest point scorer last season. They had all the significant categories, and that was mainly down to Dane Coles. His running meters, his offloads, and his line breaks were pretty impressive. Now, looking around at the depth of All Black rugby and the All Black hookers, and if we've got Coles and Mialamu, I'm not sure that Coles will be rested because of work rate or workout or how much he's being used. I'm just concerned he might be rested so that we don't get him injured. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess he's almost by default become the number one hooker. And I say that just because Mialamu's not getting any younger, and there isn't a lot of depth in that position around the country. So. Yeah, I guess he probably is, in danger of getting rested. But at the same time, if somebody's stepping up in some of the other squads, it could still be a relatively open position.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and the one last thing on the Hurricanes, is there a cooler first name in Super Rugby than Blade Thompson?
Not that I've heard of.
Yeah. I'm not sure what Mum and Dad were thinking there, but I'm sure they had their reasons. Other player that spring to mind. Go on.
Just a big fan of Wesley Snipes, I guess. Who isn't?
Who isn't? Passenger 57.
Always bet on black.
Always bet on black. Yeah, didn't mention the grey horse, but always bet on black. Absolutely. I guess it's Boom Prinsloo. I rostered him last season. Incredible output actually from someone who was relatively unknown, but I'm pretty sure that was 99% down to just having a real sweet name. Boom.
Always helps.
It does help. So
you'd really want to go Brazilian style and just go with the first name, wouldn't you? Just put it on the back of the shirt. Boom.
Absolutely, Bono and Boom. Nice. Next down into the South Island, the finalists last season, the Crusaders. What do you think of Black Todd at his team this season? For those that weren't watching rugby in the late 90s, you can thank Stu Wilson for that moniker. But what do you think of the Crusaders this season?
Robbie Fruen back, so that'll be interesting. He's had a couple of bites of the cherry, at Super Rugby over the last couple of years, and he's been held back by the heart problems that he's had. We can only assume that he's fully healthy, but we've kind of heard this before. He looks good at times. He looks like a world beater at times, but it's hard to have a lot of faith in him at this point in his career. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's a real question mark, that position. They bought Ray Lilo from the Hurricanes last season to try and be that blockbusting 13 to replace Fruen, but that didn't pan out, and what invariably happened is they started playing Slade, Carter, and they shifted Crotty out one, and that actually worked quite well. That actually provided them quite a lot of width. They got the ball to Dagg and to Ndolo a lot of the time, and that was a really dangerous combination they had going. So whether they're going to use that Fruen off the bench as the kind of battering ram to come on at 60 when everyone's done their fair share of tackling, I don't know, but it's going to be a one to watch. Certainly one to watch. I think the other kind of overarching thought process around the Crusaders is they've always been a team that tries to be very clever in terms of managing players' minutes. Who do you think are the most in danger in the Crusaders, and who do you think the alternatives are to replace them in the team?
Well, I suppose Sam Whitelock is probably the obvious one. The other obvious ones would be Ritchie McCaw. Dan Carter, I'm not sure about. Because he has missed so much time. Whether they'd actually feel the need to put him in cotton wool at this point, whether that would actually be a good thing or not. It's hard to say. And I think the same thing, in some extent, applies to Israel Dagg, who, he's probably, in some ways, he's fighting for his position, possibly in that All Black squad. So, whether they wanted to arrest him, it's hard to say.
And there's a bit of history there too with Black Todd Adder and Dagg. He's not exactly, on his Christmas card list for each other, those two. He's rested, and I've got inverted commas here in my hands, in the last couple of seasons, Dagg, and Dagg has been quite public around his dislike of being rested, shockingly. So it's going to be very interesting to see how he manages it this season.
Yeah, I think the outside back situation, the wingers for the Crusaders is pretty interesting as well. That they tend to have guys that don't necessarily have big names or have big raps on them, but if you're on the end of a Crusaders backline, you're likely to score tries. So it's guys like Caleb Ralph made a career out of that, and maybe it could be now Johnny McNichol. So not a big name, probably not someone that's going to come flying off the draft board early, but he's probably he's likely to score a decent bag of tries this year. And Ndolo, okay, we know about him. He was pretty awesome last year, but Macilai, Jonah Macilai, coming
that's
in
who I was trying to figure out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think they like him.
Well, I watched him playing a bit for Northland, and he was, he's got something. Always seems to beat the first defender, and can sort of make something out of nothing. So he'd be one to keep an eye on. Yeah,
and I think you're right. I think Ndolo obviously has that left wing now down, and you got Dagg and what they try and do it for, but maybe they bring Taylor in for a bit of a rest. I'm not too sure. Maybe even pop Slade back there for a wee bit. But that other winger spot was an X factor was a problem factor last season for Blackheaded. They actually had Fonatier out there. Now, I went and watched them play a couple of times, and I'm not sure if Fonatier is a winger, let alone a back. He's not exactly lithe, shall we say, and he's not exactly fleet of foot. So I think getting that player from Northland and also Johnny McNichol, figuring out where he plays, will go a long way to figuring out how well you go or how high you draft one of those players is probably more important.
Sure.
Yeah, Whitelock's an interesting case. I think he has to be. He played a lot of minutes last season, and I think that they're a bit of a luxury in Canterbury as well. Sorry, the Crusaders, in that they have Dom Bird and Luke Romano in there. So those are two, I say, world-class locks anyway. So I think they do have a bit of an option to say, okay, Sam, you ever sit down for a bit. I think picking up on one of the players that you mentioned is Ritchie McCaw is a classic example of he's the name. Everyone's going to try and, or everyone who doesn't know fantasy inside out is probably going to try and target him, and probably target him quite high, to be honest, whereas that may not be a very fruitful play for a couple of reasons. One being he just doesn't score the fantasy points that, say, a Hooper does, or even loose forward as a position in a whole, but also because he probably will be rested. Now that probably has much greater impact on Matt Todd. Matt Todd last year was very, very impressive with the ball in hand, running meters, but also with his tackles made. He was regularly getting into that bonus territory, which makes that kind of step above for a loose forward. So I think Matt Todd might be someone, if you were going to target a loose forward in a draft, and as we mentioned earlier, it may not be all that wise to get it high, but I think if you can get someone, Matt Todd would be an interesting pick. And I guess the last point on the Crusaders is around the front row. So they lost Corey Flynn this season. He's gone overseas. Cody Taylor, very, very impressive player for the ITM. Very, very quick, very high work rate, likes to roam in the Sean Fitzpatrick style out wide. But the incumbent is Ben Fennell, so I think they'll probably stick with Fennell because he's got the Super Rugby experience, but you keep an eye on Cody Taylor, and the Crusaders front row might be one to just pick up a little bit later and stash there or have as your starter, because he will invariably come on with about the 65-minute mark, and he will add a lot. I think going into a little bit more of a settled squad, the Highlanders, Jamie Joseph has. What are the key positions or players that you see as important to the Highlanders this season, Mossman?
Yeah, well, looking at their squad, it's sort of business as usual to a certain extent. Nothing really jumps out, in terms of additions. Vicky Toa's still there, Aaron Smith's still there, Ben Smith's still there. These are the guys that that are going to be making the waves from a fantasy perspective for the Highlanders, and they're all still there. I think the likes of Patrick Osbourne and Kurt Baker have sort of flattered to deceive a little bit in past seasons. Richard Buckman, I'm sure he'll be solid, but a little bit hard to trust.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's an interesting one. That situation is to monitor come draft time is who is that back three going to be, because they recruited Wasali Naholo from, well, actually I think he's from Auckland, but he's playing for Naki in the ITM Cup, and he's really good, he's impressive, to the point where I think they'll probably have him starting. But you've got Osbourne in the mix, and you've got Buckman, and of course you've got Ben Smith at 15, so figuring out who those two wingers were, I mean, everyone loves the Barracuda. A couple of songs made. I mean, he's very much a cult hero in the kind of Buff Laney mould, but whether Jamie Joseph sees it that way, I know he likes his hard workers, but if Osbourne, as you say, he's flattered to deceive previously, but when he gets a bit of fire in his belly, that guy is one of the toughest players to stop. He actually, if you looked at his meters gained, his defenders beaten in the games that he wasn't injured in, because he did play a lot with a kind of a 70% mark, he was really, really impressive. I think trying to figure out, I don't think Lima Sopoaga will go under the radar this Fantasy Rugby Draft. Last year in the 2014, he was a steal. People were picking him up in the 5th and 6th round, and he became like a top 10 player, but even top 5 player, I think, at one point in average points per game. So much so that we've actually ranked him 6th at this stage on our interim rankings. What do you see in Lima, Mossman? Yeah,
so you feel he's nailed on to start ahead of Hayden Parker? I guess he is at this stage.
I think so.
There's a possibility that that Parker will eat into his fantasy value a little bit.
Yep.
But yeah, definitely a solid player. He does a little bit of everything. Kicks well, kicks goals. He'll run, so from a fantasy point of view, he's doing everything that you need your guy to do.
And I wonder if there's also, going back to what we talked about before, the option of having a 12, a fly half playing at 12, and I think that may be the case at the Highlanders. So they have Jason Emery there at the moment as well, and he potentially could be a 12 for the Highlanders, but I think he's more suited to playing centre. But maybe there's the option to have Hayden Parker and Sopoaga there playing in the same team at the same time. I know they've got Marty Banks as well, who everyone kind of loves, and he's clutch, and his goal kicking is impressive as well. But I think for now Sopoaga is, and to the point where I think he's number 6, where it's not like the Crusaders situation where if you had to draft Slade and Carter, you'd have to burn a couple of very high round draft picks. I think if you picked up Sopoaga, you could easily pick up Hayden Parker as your last kind of draft round pick, just to stash on the bench in case that doesn't materialise, and as you say, that the Parker does actually become the fly half for the Highlanders. I think the other position of not necessarily too much uncertainty, but where there's probably 4 or 5 players trying to get into 3 is the loose forwards. I think Elliot Dixon played well. You got Nasi Manu and John Hardy as well. But are there any other players as a threat for that starting loose forward trio?
Yes, there is a lot of competition for those positions. I'd say maybe the guy that brings something a little bit different, and he's a bit of a wild card, is Dan Pryor. And Dan Pryor is actually, he's a cousin of a friend of mine, so I hear a lot about Dan Pryor, and I've seen him playing for Northlands, and I know what he can do, and he's maybe slightly a loose forward in a slightly smaller mould physically, but really quick. If he gets into open space, he's going to make a lot of yards. Saw him, scored a lot of tries for Northland for a guy, playing in the loose forwards. So could be one to watch. Could be a bit of a wild card there.
Yeah, it's a great call. Yeah, I remember streaking down the field many ITM Cup games. Yeah, and that would be a massive boon for any fantasy rugby draft manager. I think the only other question really around the Highlanders is there any players that are under a threat for the rest? I mean, naturally you immediately think of Ben Smith and Aaron Smith, but do you think they're under threat at all?
Aaron Smith, absolutely, I would have thought. He clocks up so many minutes, and he's become so important to the All Black, as we touched on last time. So I think there's no doubt that he'll get rested. I think just across the board at this stage, we don't know how much rest they're considering giving them. This isn't possibly going to be a repeat of what we saw under Graham Henry, where there was a big chunk of the season when that these guys missed. There isn't any indication at this stage that that's what's going to happen, but it's still a case of wait and see.
Yeah, it is. We just haven't seen anything from Shag to say, look, we're going to give these kind of contracted players the first 15 off. So I don't know. Well, I guess we'll wait and see on that, and make sure you have that information to hand when you go into your draft, because I think being able to find that depth and understand who the players that may come in for these rested players, that's gonna set you in pretty good stead on draft day. That's probably about all we have time for today. In the next pod, we'll talk through the Australian squads and try and break them down and see what their impact is in fantasy rugby draft, similar to what we did today. A quick reminder how to contact us on Twitter. It's Fantasy Rug Draft, Fantasy RUG Draft, or if you've got an email, drop us a note on support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for downloading. I'm Bruce Wilkinson. He's Nathan Mossman.
Yes, I am.
Back to your repeater.
What a bust here by Christian Cullen. Plenty of support, and what a dummy!